you, I think I am going to turn it over to Emily, who is our presenter from today. So we have Emily Embry, who is the teen librarian at the Bemis Library. And Emily, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Christine. Good afternoon, everybody. As she said, my name is Emily Embry. I have been a nerd my whole life. I have been playing Dungeons and Dragons for over 20 years, and I got my start from my local library, where one very wonderful nerdy librarian introduced very socially awkward me to a group where I could have fun and find friends and let my overactive imagination run wild. And surprising no one, I then became the teen librarian and have followed in suit, bringing the love of Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games and everything else nerdy to my folks at my library. And I'm going to have Christine, if you want to pull up that poll real quick, just so we can see what our results were. So yeah, most of you folks here, you're my people. You're nerds. You've played D&D or other tabletop role-playing games. That's what that acronym is for. Some of you probably know D&D because we've had a beautiful resurgence of Dungeons and Dragons in pop culture, from Stranger Things to Rick and Morty to live play games like Critical Role. And some of you are newbies. Welcome. I promise I will be very kind to you. And I think that that's one of the great things. It can be kind of intimidating for folks to try and break into D&D. I promise this will be a very quick and easy sort of introduction. So if we can go back to the slides. So for those of you who are newbies, what is this weird Dungeons and Dragons thing? So Dungeons and Dragons has been around for nearly 50 years. It is what I like to define as a collaborative storytelling game, which means that the story itself technically doesn't need anything except people sitting around and talking together. It is generally set in high fantasy, so imagine your, witches and wizards and, flying cities and all sorts of interesting things. And Dungeons and Dragons is very versatile. It can be presented in a number of different ways, either in person or virtual. With the pandemic over the last year, virtual platform Dungeons and Dragons has become very popular. And it is something that has been, like I said, really ramping up in the, pop culture zeitgeist recently. There on Twitch are at any time probably hundreds upon hundreds of people streaming what we call actual play Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games.
Oh, it looks like we may have lost Emily. So if everybody can just hang tight for a moment, she may have just had a weird internet surge. Sorry about that. The summer internet's been wonky. So many people using it. So we appreciate it.
Oh no!
There she
I'm
is.
back. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
No worries.
Yes, I did fail my internet skill check roll, Kate. You are correct. So I will get away from that little anecdote because apparently the internet doesn't like anecdotes. So we're going to talk today in 3 elements. We're going to talk, and I like to give the analogy of how deep are you going to be going in Dungeons and Dragons. The shallow level for libraries is literally just making sure that the books are available to your patrons. So there's going to be a portion where we talk about building a collection. What are the books that you need, and what are the books that can supplement your existing collection? We're also going to be talking about facilitating programs in partnership with others. So if you are interested in creating a space where others can run games, we're going to talk about what that entails. And then we're going to talk about actual dungeon mastering. So if you yourself are interested in getting into this, we're going to give you a very brief intro. So I'm going to ask Christine to pull up the poll, and I'm just going to sort of gauge what are you folks most interested in? And I'll try and weight the conversation toward whatever is most interesting to y'all. Okay. It's a fight. Okay, that's awesome. It looks like a lot of you either probably already have Dungeons and Dragons books for your collection, or or that's just not something that you're worrying about. Most of you, though, it does look like you're interested in actually getting into running the games. Excellent. Okay. We can go back to the slides I think we're probably good here. All right. So I'll try and focus more on the facilitating programs for others and facilitating programs yourself. So let's go on to the next one. So very quickly, talking about collection building. The basic that you need to know about having books available in your collection is that there are 4 categories of official rule books from Wizards of the Coast. I'd also like to say I'm going to be talking a lot about Wizards of the Coast and their products. I am not endorsed, or they don't even know who I am. So I'm just telling you because Dungeons and Dragons is near and dear to my heart. So the 4 categories of official books include what we consider the core rule books, which is the literal, like, bare minimum of what you need. There are supplemental rule books that expand upon those, campaign guides that give you settings to place your games in, and adventures, which give you sort of a framework of a story that you can run players through. So the core rule books, as I said, if you have nothing else at your patron's disposal, have these 3. The player's handbook is used, as the name suggests, by the players. It's the piece of information that lets them create their characters, gives them basic information about their spells and abilities. Everybody is going to need to at least be able to have access to a player's handbook during the course of play. The second most important one is the Dungeon Master's Guide. This gives information to dungeon masters about the creation of the world, the creation of threats for their players, cosmology, world building, all sorts of really interesting stuff. And the monster manual, the third most important, this is where all of those fun critters come in. If anyone saw the movie Onward, that infamous gelatinous cube is a classic. There's everything in here from aboleths to owlbears to sphinxes, dragons, zombies, and all sorts of other critters. All right. And going on to collection building, the next element of that is the supplemental rule books. These are extra rules that can be added onto the framework built in the main core collection. These are not necessarily like required, but there's a whole lot of really interesting information. Volo's Guide to Monsters gives a lot of extra insight into the psychology of some of the monsters and their tactics. Zenithar's Guide to Everything has a little bit of everything, and expanded some ideas about things that your players can do in between combat situations. Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes does very similar to Volo's Guide to Monsters. And then the really cool thing is that Dungeons and Dragons is a very progressive organization, and they try and include things. And Tasha's Cauldron to Everything might be one of my most favorite ones. It talks a lot about LGBTQIA elements of gaming and sort of expands from a lot of the basic core rules are pretty simple and pretty well, basic. And this allows for sort of information on how to expand things, like how to explain, different elements of society that just haven't been a part of the conversation in Dungeons and Dragons in the last 50, so years. Right. And the next thing we're going to talk about are campaign guides. And Christine, if there's any questions in the chat, I will ask you to please don't be afraid to interrupt. But are we doing good so far?
We're doing good. Just a little bit of discussion about D&D Beyond and whether anybody has had good access, providing access to the patrons to the online.
Cool. And I will be talking about D&D
The,
Beyond very shortly. So getting back to the
perfect.
book books then. So I'll keep that in mind and we'll talk about D&D Beyond a little bit more. Campaign guides are what I would call, you know, in like fantasy series, sometimes the author comes up with that, like, you know, like a guidebook to Pern or a guidebook to Westeros. The campaign guide is effectively a a book that tells you about a location, the people in that location, the history of that location, and it sets.
Well, there may be Dungeons and Dragons in the internet today, so hopefully Emily will be right back. So sorry. We did test everything a couple days ago, so not. She's back, maybe.
I am having the worst luck. I apologize. All right. Anyway, campaign guides give you a place to set your worlds. Okay, but perhaps the most important thing for facilitating games in the library are adventures. Adventures are self-contained scenarios with goals, threats, and plots. So basically, you have your inciting incident of what's going on, that your heroes are going to go in and you know do something. It gives you information about characters. It gives you information about the threats that are going to be showing up in this adventure. If you are trying to learn to facilitate games in a library, try and make sure that you have at least a couple of these. There are other places you can get adventures, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But these are the official ones published by Wizards of the Coast, and there's all of the ISBNs for these. The presentation itself is available in PDF form, and you'll be able to go through and browse those. But like I said, if you have nothing else, have copies of the first three books, Player's Guide, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual for your folks. Okay.
Well, maybe third time will be the charm. My apologies. Not quite sure what the issue is because we did test this, so we appreciate
I'm
you
gonna
guys
cry.
being patient. You're doing
Oh,
fine.
goodness.
You're not gone very
Thank
long,
you.
so just rolling.
It's just funky. I wonder if there's like a I'm in the meeting room downstairs. I'm wondering if there's like a patron sitting right on top of where my Wi-Fi is coming
Mm,
through. Anyway, so
yep.
facilitating the programs in your library. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. If your space is, you know, if you have meeting rooms, that's always the best way to go. Insofar as the content goes, you are actually well situated as librarians to be able to access free digital content. Wizards of the Coast, the Digital Club Support Program, actually is giving out free licenses, free bundles of licenses to D&D Beyond. D&D Beyond, as has been mentioned in the chat, is a virtual toolkit for Dungeons and Dragons online. It allows for people to have access to the exact same content that comes in the books, but it's available in sort of a virtual searchable systems resource document. And it's really, really helpful. And as librarians, if you submit a request through this support program with your library email and your contact information, you can get free copies of those core information guides, the D&D Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. And I think that they might also throw in a couple of adventures. I don't remember. So that's the first thing, is if you're trying to get people to come into your space and run D&D, you can offer them access to virtual content if you're willing to create a D&D Beyond library for your for your library's use. You can also reach out to other organizations. Wizards of the Coast has something called the Adventurers League, which is an official organized play event organizer. They You can find them mostly at your local gaming stores or maybe some other community groups. Oftentimes, there'll be a few people who are the folks who get to run the games. They're called adventure captains, I believe. It's been a while since I've checked into their information. But if you contact these folks and say, "Hey, we have this space. We're willing to, host you," you might be able to get folks to come in and literally just run it for free. Speaking of your local comic and game shops, I cannot stress this enough. Become friends with your friendly local game store. The people in there are going to be desperate for places to meet and play Dungeons and Dragons because everyone is coming out of the pandemic. Everyone wants a chance to get in on those games again. And if your library can facilitate that, I think it's going to be a great way to encourage patrons to come into the library and also give them that, safe and comfortable space. And of course, your patrons are going to be your very best resource. If you have patrons who are interested in D&D, you're going to be able to find a built-in player base, possibly even people who are willing to run games for you. Now, what are the things you're going to need for facilitating in-person programs? Literally, the least you need are tables and chairs, and that's kind of it. There's a whole bunch of things you can provide to your players that would be helpful, things including dice, which during the course of Dungeons and Dragons, all of the rolls of chance are portrayed by rolls on dice. And we're going to talk about that once we get into dungeon mastering. I have in my library a few sets of dice that if folks show up and they don't have their own dice, which happens more than you might suspect, folks can borrow a set of dice for the day. There's also things you could do if you wanted to get really super fancy, like getting a collection of miniatures for your library. I have not yet delved into the lending of miniatures in kits. Some of them are very intricate and some of them can be rather expensive, but you can also very easily make miniatures out of paper. You can 3D print if your library has 3D printing. There are an incredible array of STL files that are available online for free or for support the artist. And you can 3D print your own Dungeons and Dragons models. And I'm going to tell you right now, a painting party is a great offshoot program. You get a bunch of unpainted D&D minis. Get your patrons all excited with paintbrushes, and it's a lot of fun. The other thing I would like to suggest is snacks, especially if you're the sort of person dealing with children or adolescents. Food is the number one incentive for most folks to come to programs like this. And Dungeons and Dragons usually lasts for a small session, usually will last for at least an hour. So if you're trying to encourage folks, I cannot suggest enough, try and budget in some snack money. Now, if your space does not allow for content, like this, if you don't have a lot of meeting room space, or if you don't have anything like that, you can in fact find your way into running D&D virtually. There was a really fantastic article in American Libraries back in November of last year, I think. It was called Escape for the Isolated. And it's talking about a number of libraries that shifted their in-person Dungeons and Dragons programmings to virtual. And there are a couple of things that come into that. If you're trying to either build a new virtual D&D club or transition to a virtual D&D club, there are a bunch of things that you can bring into the mix to make things easier. If you don't have a lot of money, you can absolutely forego these virtual tabletop programs. And yes, in fact, that is the article. Very good catch. You can actually run D&D with something as simple as a message board. If you have kids or older patrons who are, disciplined and who are able to share that virtual space comfortably together, I have seen libraries with Discord servers where they have entire channels where kids play D&D all day. Yes. And Jesse mentioned theater of the mind. Theater of the mind is a term used to describe the playing of Dungeons and Dragons and other games where there's no props and there's no battle maps. Everything that you do by describing. A really great example of this is if anyone is looking for supplemental material, the McElroy brothers of My Brother and Me fame have a really excellent actual play D&D podcast called The Adventure Zone. Everything that they do is theater of the mind. They don't have miniatures and they don't have maps. They just describe sort of in relation where things are. So, but going back to the virtual tabletop platforms, if your library does have the ability to purchase one of these or use it, I can't tell you the amount of like creative, creative juices that you get flowing when you can actually see a map in front of you. So I have 4 of these virtual tabletop platforms listed here. Again, no one's paying me anything. I just know these because I'm a nerd and I try and find the best ones for myself. Roll20 is probably the most basic and most accessible. It is free, although you can pay for additional features and cutting down on ads and such for a small fee. Fantasy Grounds is really fancy and the cost shows. There are other programs through, in fact, this is through Steam, the virtual video game platform. Tabletop Simulator allows you to create virtual maps using 3D rendered tokens. And Tailspire is very new. It just got out of Kickstarter, I think about a year ago. And it is very similar to Tabletop Simulator. It has a lot of stuff cooked into it so far as rules and setting up for content to be expanded later on. So those are the big fancies. I won't trouble you on how to do those. There's a bunch of really excellent YouTube videos that will teach you how to optimize your play on Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds or Tailspire or any of those. But the other thing I suggest is having some form of digital communication. I think that Dungeons and Dragons is perhaps best played when you have at least the voice to interact with folks. I think that there's a lot of really excellent play that happens on Discord servers and message boards, but there's nothing like hearing your players shriek when you tell them about the manticore descending upon them from the sky. It's great. So I strongly suggest looking into using Zoom, Google Hangouts, Discord, Facebook Messenger, any of the other sort of virtual communication platforms we've gotten really comfortable using. And then, of course,
She did, Tyler. She did. We went a while though without her disappearing, so she'll be back in a sec if the past disappearances or anything. Um, you guys are sharing such great information. I'm going to make sure to capture the chat as well to get that post to get all of the.
It was going so well.
It was. It's so funny because everybody's like, "Did she roll a 1 again?" Yeah.
I know. I love this. Y'all are hilarious. Okay, so the D&D Beyond Virtual Toolkit. If you have a chance to get D&D Beyond content, and as I said, you can, as a qualifying educator or facilitator, you can get a lot of this for free. But you do have to purchase other modules and content. But the things that you purchase, if you have a membership, you are able to share access to all of that content with your players. If they are a part of a campaign that you are running, that is to say that they have their own D&D account and you've added them to a running campaign, they are able to access anything that you have purchased. There's some really excellent stuff to be had there. It makes it really easy. A great, for instance, I had a group we were running over the pandemic, and we had a bunch of the kids, and they all were able to create their own virtual character sheets, and I was able to share with them pictures from the content guides of the guard drakes that they were fighting. They were able to really easily and quickly look up spells, which cuts down on the amount of time it takes to run a table, I'll tell you what. So I really can't suggest enough. It is a bit of an investment, but it's very helpful for facilitating that virtual content for your students or your participants. Okay. Do we have any questions so far before we jump into dungeon mastering itself?
I don't think so. Taking a quick look. A lot of just great information being shared, so I'm going to capture the chat and add that with the resources.
I am really excited to go back and read the chat, so you all keep sharing all of your fantastic ideas. So, okay, so we're going to jump into dungeon mastering. This is the big chunky enchilada of information. So we're going to start off with the question, what is a dungeon master? Dungeon master is a
Just to get y'all set up and excited. She'll be back. And while we're waiting, Tyler has a question. Has anyone ever played a warlock before? So feel free to discuss amongst yourselves.
Oh my gosh. I'm back. Hello. I'm sorry. So the dungeon master is the person in charge of creating the story that the players run around in. The dungeon master has the important role of acting as anybody who isn't the player's characters, which means that you are the damsel in distress and you are also the dragon that is trying to eat her. You are the captain of the guard, and you're also the thief who is trying to evade capture. You are all of these different characters, and you have to sort of like build the world for your players in that way. You are the person who gets to look at the rule books and make judgments on the rules as they apply to your current situations with your players. And you work together with your players to basically move the story forward. So put very simply, you are the storyteller, you are the arbiter, and you are the world. It's a little bit of a job description.
And I do have a question.
Yes.
Emily, somebody was wondering if people who have had minimal experience playing Dungeons and Dragons have ever been successful as a dungeon master, which I think is a great question.
I think that's a really great question. And I think that there is definitely a place for a very enthusiastic beginner. I think that there's certainly a lot of D&D comes down to, are you comfortable making judgments, and are you comfortable being consistent in those judgments? One of the great things about 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, the edition that we're in right now, is that there is a movement toward the idea that it doesn't really matter if you're perfect so far as the rules in the book go, so long as you are consistent. So someone who perhaps has never had experience playing Dungeons and Dragons, if they're willing to play
and she'll be back. But it looks like we're getting a lot of great feedback on that question in the chat as well. So a lot of support, which I think is great too. So I don't know, maybe there needs to be like a Cal or some sort of library Dungeon and Dragons like Facebook group or something.
Anyway, so I guess the simple answer to the question is yes. If you've had very little experience but are really excited, you are absolutely, able and welcome to do the jump into being a dungeon master. The more you do it, the better you will get at it. And that is the last statement on the last slide that I have. If you start off as a dungeon master, it's the same as doing anything for the first time. You're not going to be perfect, but you are putting yourself out there and you are trying. And the most important thing is that you are making yourself like the coolest person to the people who are running the game with you, who are playing the game with you. It takes a lot of guts to be a dungeon master. And yes, I think that someone starting off can feel really intimidated. I urge you to push past that intimidation though. And I think I might have saw a couple of other questions. Let me go back up. If you see them,
She was also asking about tools to help you get started with the rules.
yeah. So the first thing I strongly suggest is to get the core rule books and just you don't have to memorize them, but I suggest reading through them to get yourself familiar with at least some of the basic rules. You don't have to go through and read the monster manual in depth. What you want to do is you want to read some of the information about how to create a balanced encounter. And that's going to show up in the monster manual and also in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There are a bunch of different creatures. Some of them are more deadly than others. And although it can be a lot of fun to terrify your players with an enormous, like overpowered creature, it's good to try and make sure that what you're throwing at them is at least toward their level of difficulty. And there's a lot of really excellent YouTube channels, a lot of excellent books and articles online. There's going to be some information about that a little bit further on where I talk about where to find information on how to get started. So I will circle back to that in just a moment. And were there any other questions for now? I think those were the only questions that I saw. If there's any others, Christine, do please holla. But moving on, so the basics of
And Tyler, I'll make sure that when she comes back, she addresses your question too. I was muted. So sorry about this, guys. You guys are great for hanging in.
and then the internet cuts out. You can make it or I think the most important thing is to make sure that you as a dungeon master are bringing the world to life. So when I describe a room like that, I'd say you slide down the abandoned corridor in the sunken city and you find yourself in a room. It's, you know, corners are shaded. It's too dark to see into the far corners of the room, but in the center of the room there is a gently glowing plinth. There is water that's trickling from it in a strange luminescence. There's the smell of mildew, and as your eyes adjust to the darkness, you see in the corner there is a pile of bones. That is much better than just saying you're in a 10-foot by 20-foot room and there's something in the middle. As you describe the environment, your players get to describe how they interact with the environment. So one person might say that they go over to the plinth and try and figure out, you know, where the water is coming from. Someone might go over and kick the bones to see if they can find something worth looting from the body. Someone else might try and like sneak over into one of the dark corners, see if there's anything that's eluded their investigation so far. After the players tell you what their desired actions are in the environment that you've given them, you narrate the results. You tell them that once they get to the plinth, there is a statue of a crying fairy embedded in the center of the plinth, and it seems as though the water is coming from her eyes. You can tell the person who goes off into the corner that they find a patch of the wall that seems to have been scratched free of lichen, and they get to investigate that further. You can tell the person who went over and kicked the skeleton that in fact, oh, that skeleton just came to life and is now trying to eat your eyeballs. Um,
And I'm loving how like the session is just continuing with the chat, and then
Like
Emily disappears.
keeping your internet connected. Woof. Um, Anything that you do is usually going to require a roll of a 20-sided dice. You're going to add any relevant modifiers and add any bonuses or penalties. And you're going to compare what you get for that final number against what we call the difficulty class, or DC. DCs come in a bunch of different ranges. Something that's very simple has what we consider a DC that is very low, so probably something between the numbers of 0 and 10. So you roll a 20-sided dice, and so long as you roll, better than a 10, you're probably going to be okay at that. Things that are harder include things like trying to climb up a slippery cavern wall, or trying to hit an armored monster with an attack with your weapon. These things might be as much as like a DC of 15 or even higher. So that is kind of the basics of how to play Dungeons and Dragons. And this is a super simplified version. It is by no means all that there is to Dungeons and Dragons, but the basic interactions include describing the environment, listening to the events, and narrating the results, and rolling dice to determine skills and chance. Now, D&D can be a very different experience for different people depending upon what sort of story you're trying to tell. I like to kind of give the breakdown of how long does D&D run for in 3 different levels. So a one-shot, I like you to think of this as kind of like a poem. It's very small, it's very succinct, usually goes for between 2 to 4 hours. I've had games that go as low as 1 hour, but most of those tend to not be very fulfilling, and the kids tend to demand.
So while we wait for Emily to come back, um, I'm trying to think what I might do at the end of the session, since you guys are all like into it, is I might have you guys email. I'll give you my email address at the end of the session, and if people who are interested in connecting with other people who are here today want to email me, then I'll create like an email group where you guys can all kind of like chat together. But I don't want people putting it in the chat right now, because the recording will be uploaded. So remind me of that at the.
I'm back. All right.
Yay!
So a one shot is really great, and you can actually make it easy for your players to be able to just jump right in by having pre-made characters that they can just choose and pick up. Adventure arcs are stories that I would consider like a short story. So rather than a poem, they're like a short story. They go for a couple of sessions. So imagine a couple of one shots sort of strung together. These are great for groups or clubs that meet on a semi-regular basis. I had an adventure arc for my teens where we were playing it was basically Middle Earth 5 years after the War of the Ring. And there were a group of knights in red armor who were going around trying to find remaining pieces of the gems that had been used to craft the 9 rings for mortal men. And the patrons I was playing with, they got to like interact with different characters at different times. Sometimes there were weeks where someone didn't show up. Sometimes there were people who wanted to jump in new, and I got to add their characters in sort of like in the middle of the story. It's really good, and it allows for sort of people to come back in and out. Now, a campaign is what I think a lot of the epic level questers are hungry for. A campaign is the novel of Dungeons and Dragons. It can go on, I should say, for many years, and it's best played with consistent and dedicated groups of players. If I had been continuing my Dungeons and Dragons program with my students, I probably would have turned this into a full campaign and allowed for them to interact with different parts of the world outside of what I had initially created. So Imagine how much is the time commitment for this. One shots are short and can be done very easily in a library program run by you or run by someone from like the Adventurers League. Adventure arcs are best with you if you use them with
And she will be back shortly. At least she gets connected quickly again.
time and waited until I got over to the next slide. Okay, so for pre-made adventures, as I've talked about, there are a lot of places you can find pre-made adventures that would be good for one-shots or for adventure arcs. Most of these can be found in the campaign guides and adventure books from Wizards of the Coast. However, that is not the only place you can find these sorts of things. The Dungeon Masters Guild is an online collection of both official Wizards of the Coast created modules and community created adventures and rule books. There are people who, like me, are super nerdy and find it really fun to I'm so sorry, I'm back. So if you're the sort of library that needs content but doesn't necessarily have a huge budget, Dungeon Masters Guild is a really great place to find adventures. In addition, as I said before, D&D Beyond has access to all manner of different content, the same stuff you'd get from the campaign guides and adventurer books, but there are also campaigns and adventures that are available in virtual format only through D&D Beyond. And once you unlock that content, you can share it with others if you have the membership. And I think that we are still in where you can share with up to 5 different campaigns. And I think each campaign can have up to 12 players, if I remember correctly. There's a rule that they put in place. It used to be you could only share with 3 different campaigns, which means you could only share with 3 different groups of folks playing. But that has been increased through D&D Beyond. And there are also you probably know what I'm talking about. And yes, I did just cut out there. All right. So with all this in mind, you have a lot of resources and you have a lot of direction you can go, but what makes a good dungeon master? And I think that going back to the question of can a new player run D&D or someone who's new to Dungeons and Dragons run Dungeons and Dragons? Yes, but you need to have a couple of really great skills. The most important element of running Dungeons and Dragons is being good at collaboration, which means listening, which means taking information in and making a part of the story that you're telling. Improvisation is a phenomenal skill. It is one of the most important things in your toolkit, and I strongly suggest learning to take what people say and turn it into your yes and your yes but. And as I said before, you will not be excellent the first. I was getting really good. Like there was a moment of like narrative tension there. Anyway, the point is, the more you try Dungeons and Dragons, the more you practice Dungeons and Dragons, the better you will be. And I promise you that the folks who play D&D are there for the fun and are there for the experience. And even if you're not perfect, it's still going to be a wonderful experience for them. And I saw in chat, we're talking a little bit about player size. That is a fantastic question, and I was hoping someone would ask it. My suggestion so far as player size goes, and this is the great reason to try and partner with someone in your community who is interested in running Dungeons and Dragons. The ideal table, in my opinion, is no larger than 6 to 8 players. The reason why is that every person, when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, should have a chance to voice their opinions, voice their actions, take their turns insofar as like their attacks and investigations and such. If you get much bigger than 6 to 8 people, it starts to get really hairy. My first librarian, when I was first learning Dungeons and Dragons, she would run on average between 8 to 15 people for a group at a regular time. And I'm not going to lie, we would be lucky if we could get through maybe 2 rounds of combat in an hour or 2. It gets nuts. If you are doing more than 6 to 8 people at a table, you're asking for trouble. My personal sweet spot is actually 5 players or less per table. I think that you have to balance being able to make your content available to as many people as possible. And we're back. So continuing on, yes, Kobold Fight Club. In fact, I think I have that. It's either on this this slide or the next slide. So there are a bunch of really excellent tools to help you either learn more about doing Dungeons and Dragons or how to be a good dungeon master. Someone was asking about how to get started. These 3 YouTube channels that I've put up here. GM Tips, which was published by Geek and Sundry a couple of years ago, very helpful. Handbook or Helper, published by Critical Role with Matt Mercer and Satine Phoenix, covers a lot of the same content, but goes into a lot more detail. A lot of Satine Phoenix's conversations revolve around things like identity in Dungeons and Dragons, playing Dungeons and Dragons with children, things like consent in gaming, all sorts of really fantastic things. Kayla, I swear you've read ahead and you know all the things, because a lot of what you're saying is on my later slides here. But if you want examples, I can't stress this enough. The best thing to do is probably to actually watch some people playing D&D. Critical Role I've mentioned a couple of times. D20 Dames is a fantastic group of all female players and dungeon masters. Maze Arcana, again, run by Satine Phoenix, is a really good sort of family-friendly Dungeons and Dragons live play example. And then here are some other ones. The Dungeons and Dragons alternatives. I like to list this for folks who maybe aren't sure if they can swing D&D, because there are still some communities where Dungeons and Dragons is a little bit frowned upon or not well understood. This is a great way to start people getting into the idea of Dungeons and Dragons or role-playing games. Mice and Mystics is a great board game that has sort of that D&D experience of having the battle map and the miniatures. No Thank You Evil is a very good Dungeons and Dragons analog, specifically written to be very palatable for kids and for families who are maybe a little bit concerned about some of the themes in Dungeons and Dragons. And I love Pugmire. It's Dungeons and Dragons, but you play as sentient anthropomorphic dogs. It's the best. And I have a couple further resources. Shameless self plug. I did a How to Be a Dungeon Master event for Bemis Public Library back in May of last year. That is available through YouTube. Consent in Gaming is a really excellent thing to read a little bit further insofar as how to incorporate Dungeons and Dragons in a safe and healthy way for people who maybe are nervous to sort of put themselves into that role-playing situation. The animated spell book is not family friendly and sometimes is not even safe for work, but is a hilarious resource to learn a little bit more about some of the spells and some of the mechanics in Dungeons and Dragons. And as mentioned before in the chat, The Monsters Know What They're Doing by Keith Ammonen is a really excellent book to add to your collection. If you want to get into running D&D, it gives you actual like psychological breakdowns of a lot of the different monsters and how to incorporate them in your next game. And I believe that that's the end. Yeah,
Well, we do have,
that's
yes, we do, and we do have time for questions. First of all, I wanted to say a huge thank you to Emily for sharing information today and for popping in and out as she could. And I also want to say a huge thank you to all of you. I want to say this is probably the most chat we've had in any session that I have run, and the fact that you guys kept the conversation going as Emily kind of left and came back was great. I am popping Emily's contact information into the chat. And I'm going to move to a couple wrap-up slides, but if you guys have more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We do have a poll that we would love, or not a poll, a survey that we would love to have you fill out today, and you can let us know what you liked about today's session and what you didn't. You can either click on the link in the screen, or I just posted it in chat. I am typing, and I can't type and talk at the same time. Hang on.
I didn't like how much the presenter kept on popping out of the channel. That was bad.
All right, I just added my email to the chat. You can use my email for two things. One, if you need a certificate for today's session. Two, if you would like to email me your address, and I can kind of like gather because everybody was so happy to share information. I'm thinking it would be great to, at the very least gather email addresses, which I don't necessarily want to do in the chat that's going to be posted online. But if you send me your email address and say, I want to be connected with everybody, I'll just create a master list because you all were just chatting so great amongst yourselves about so many things. And I will post the recording and the chat and the resources that you all shared hopefully will be available later this afternoon.
And I'm going back
any
through
other
for questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the questions I saw, Lauren R. asked, no Tomb of Horrors during the Adventures guide. So Tomb of Horrors is an old classic adventure that was published right back at the very beginning of Dungeons and Dragons. It has been retooled the Tomb of Annihilation. Is perhaps one of the most fun campaign settings. So not Tomb of Horrors, Tomb of Annihilation. All the fun, just a more intense verb.
And we did have a couple questions about like pre-written adventures, but I think you addressed that. So if the person that asked that does not think that we addressed it well, let us know.
And if you want suggestions or if you just want to talk about what makes a good adventure, please don't hesitate to email me. Either my work email at littletongov.org or the library bard Gmail account. I am so happy to talk D&D all day.
Yeah. And earlier on, Kate did have a question about, does anybody have any experience dealing with the sometimes very sexist aspects of the role-playing culture?
I do. I do have experience with that. When you've been playing for 20 years, it's hard not to have that experience, unfortunately. And I think that's one of the great things about the movement of Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast recently. I do think that there is a real emphasis on trying to, to tell the gatekeepers to step back and to allow for people to, enjoy the game regardless of who they are. One of the things that I have found is, frankly, the sort of people who come to a library for Dungeons and Dragons are usually of a mind of, they're there for the fun, and they're there for the interaction. As a dungeon master, and especially as a librarian facilitating the program, you might find yourself in a position where you have to address behaviors that are not okay. Sometimes there will be, sexist or racist or ableist comments made in a table. And I think that in the same way we would address it as librarians, in our spaces, if someone is saying something, racist, sexist, or ableist as a patron, just the fact that they're doing it at the table as their character doesn't make.
Oh gosh.
I'm back. All right. Having a initiative order is a really great idea. Initiative is something that happens during combat to allow for people to know when their turn is coming. Having initiative, either on a whiteboard, or if you're doing it virtually, having like a list of who's going in what order keeps people in mind. And if folks are being disruptive when it's not their turn, you can let them know, you've got a warning, and if you don't listen, perhaps you can, either impose like a penalty on their next action, or if you're having people who are consistently, not paying attention and not, keeping themselves quiet during other people's turns, that's a time to talk to them.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we got
And
everybody's
Effie, I love
questions.
that.
Sorry, the chat was. Oh, go ahead.
Chat's good. Chat's good.
Yeah. So I think we got everybody's questions. If we didn't, my apologies. And once again, I want to extend a great thank you to Emily for sharing information, and for you guys for all of the sharing that you guys have done. Librarians love to share information, and I think it's great. Our next CSLN session is going to be on Thursday, July 22nd at noon Colorado time, when my colleagues Beth Christ and Jean Heilig are going to present a session on using courage to confront bias. So hopefully you can join us for that. And once again, I'm going to type my information or my email in the chat as we log off. So if you need a certificate, or if you want to be added to the email list, of which I'm not really sure what we're going to do with, but then you guys can talk amongst yourselves. So I'll put that in the chat.
And thank you all for
has a...
I flickered in and out.
Yes, and thanks everybody for